Imagine a world where Unohana was never killed by Kenpachi, and instead was around to help take the fight to the Sternritter during the second Quincy invasion. How different would things be? With this ancient Shinigami in their ranks, one who has mastered both the arts of healing and of swordplay, could the Gotei 13 put up a better, more successful fight against the Vandenreich during that second enormous battle? A war that, while a little more balanced than the first invasion, still ultimately saw the Soul Society find themselves on the back foot and struggling to make any real headway, all the while allowing Yhwach to achieve his end goal of making it to the palace. I have to wonder how much Daten the Vandenreich has on Unohana's true self, considering she likely took up the mantle of Retsu not too long after that original war from 1,000 years ago. There's quite a lot to look at here, including one pivotal question. Which version of Unohana are we talking about? Were this scenario to ever play out in this alternate reality, which persona of the 4th Division captain would we be most likely to see on the battlefield, and why? Would it be the kindly, good-natured face of Retsu, or the sinister, blood-drenched gaze of Yachiru? As with all of my previous What If videos, I like to try and approach it from a realistic perspective where I can, by which I mean, how does this new scenario fit into the larger story as a whole? And so I think it's important to open this discussion by looking at what might change as a result of keeping Unohana alive, both for the world around her, but also for her character too. Is there a realistic scenario where the two Kenpachi could have coexisted side by side? So without further ado, let's take a look. Would Unohana make a dramatic difference to the war effort of the Soul Society during the second Quincy invasion, or would everything play out in much the same way it did before? Let's find out. Remember guys, if you enjoyed today's video, to consider hitting subscribe down below, it really does help out, and also check out my other channel, Mr. Tomo Talks Games, and maybe hit subscribe over there as well. Your support is greatly appreciated. And so, before we dive into the battle itself, we need to understand what exactly has changed due to Unohana still being alive, and an active participant in the war. It's kind of crazy to think that Unohana, despite being around for at least some of the fighting, simply doesn't get involved in any of it at all. So we don't have any kind of barometer for how she'd fare against the Sternritter. And to be honest, the mere idea of Yachiru Unohana in particular facing off against the Quincy is admittedly a very tantalizing one. And by the way, despite having Unohana survive the training with Kenpachi, the idea is that the outcome remains the same. Nothing changes for Kenpachi in that regard. He still learns the name of his Zanpakuto and unlocks Shikai. The question is, what happens next? Look, the truth is that as Unohana's story doesn't really intersect with Ichigo's in any real major way, I genuinely don't believe that her surviving would have that big of a ripple effect on the world around her. It's not the same as Izengin and Tosen potentially not defecting from the Gotei 13. That's quite a big deal. Here, I really don't think too much is going to change. This is more of a personal transformation, a personal change that will weigh heavily on the characters involved, which is what we're going to look at now. So, in regards to the end of Kenpachi's training, like I said, the outcome still needs to remain the same for it to mean anything. Maybe he still ends up running Unohana through with his blade, but she heals herself once more and declares that at last the training is complete, though that feels much too simplistic and much too clean. Considering Unohana went into that training wanting to die in order to truly pass on the blood-soaked title of Kenpachi and all the history and baggage that comes with it, it's a little difficult to envision a future where she actively saves her own life in the end, even with Kenpachi pleading for her not to die, not to end their battle. Unohana still knew what she had to do ultimately, what she wanted to do. This moment upends the entire lineage of Kenpachi as we thought we knew it. In actuality, there aren't 11 Kenpachi as we knew it before. There are only 2 true holders of the Kenpachi name, Yachiru and Zaraki, since one has to die to pass it on. And, well, until this moment, Unohana was very much alive. Well, alive in some sense, at least, though there's a definite sense that it's this fight that truly revives her true self anyway, for one last hurrah. Considering Unohana is the founder of the Kenpachi tradition, in some ways it's possible to look at this like it's her life's work. The title of Kenpachi is utterly meaningless unless those involved adhere to the rules, and so again, Unohana saving herself seems highly unlikely. That being said, there is an avenue to keeping Unohana alive that makes sense to me anyway, and kind of works. Again, at least for me. It can't be by her own hand, so there are only a couple of options. I could quite easily see a future where Unohana thinks she dies, only to open her eyes a few days later and find herself on a bed in the 4th Division Infirmary. Isane has saved her life, maybe with Hanataro by her side or something like that. There could even be a little hint that Zaraki was the one who brought them Unohana's near-death body. Although he never comes out and says it, perhaps the implication is that he wanted them to save her. But, with tears welling in her eyes, Isane blubbers that she knows that rescuing Unohana from death is robbing her of the meaning of her name, and of being able to pass it on, and she's extremely apologetic. It's important to remember that Isane knows exactly what's going on. Whether she always knew, or she only finds out in Unohana's letter to her, I don't know, but personally, I much prefer the idea that Isane has known about Unohana's true identity for a while now, and all that letter really said was that this time Unohana wasn't coming back, and was entrusting the division to Isane. Anyway, in the manga, when Kenpachi tells Isane that he killed Unohana, Isane collapses to the ground in a mix of sadness and relief, happy that Unohana's name has finally been able to be passed on. What I'm getting at is it's not like Isane wouldn't know what it means to save Unohana's life in this circumstance. She knows that she is taking something from her, hell, even disrespecting her final wishes. This is a pretty big deal, and a big character moment. A betrayal, even, that needs to be addressed. Which is why I think it's important that bringing Unohana back isn't Isane's selfish wish. That's why I think it's important that it is implied, at least, that it was something that Kenpachi Zaraki, the new holder of the title of Kenpachi, wanted to happen. Basically ordered to happen. You know, maybe by Unohana's bedside, Isane muses that Yachiru Unohana did, in fact, die that day down in Muken. Or perhaps even better, Isane is bawling her eyes out about the fact that she's stolen Unohana's choice from her, but Kenpachi barks at them from the doorway that he saw Yachiru Unohana die with his own eyes and he made sure of it. You know, it's one of those moments where no one says it outright, but the subtext is clear. Yachiru Unohana can stay gone forever, but Retsu can live on. Is this still a betrayal of what Unohana wanted? Of course, which is likely why it didn't happen in the manga. But this is just a what-if video, and like I said, I like to at least try and address these points, try to get to these points in a realistic way. But this is a tough one, and I think it needs to be addressed that were Unohana to be brought back, were Unohana to survive in this way, it is against her wishes. It is being done selfishly by those around her, and maybe Kenpachi himself should be forced to address that. You know, maybe he gives the whole spiel that if Unohana's unhappy about being brought back, then she can come and kill him herself. The kind of thing that Kenpachi might say. But this is a hard one. Also, in terms of the timeline as presented to us by the manga, it's a tricky one as well. As we know, Isane doesn't see Kenpachi again until after the second invasion has already begun. So maybe we would have to mess with the sequence of events a little bit. So truth be told, as much as we all wanted to see Yachiru Unohana specifically taking up arms against the Quincy, getting to that scenario organically feels almost impossible to me, but of course we'll still discuss it nonetheless. Now, here's the funny thing about Unohana. No one cared about her at all until the Thousand Year Blood War arc. Now that's a sweeping generalization, I'm sure she had some fans out there somewhere, but ultimately it is harsh, but it's true. We all knew she was hiding something, we all knew characters found her frightening, and Kubo teased in an interview prior to the Thousand Year Blood War arc, possibly even as part of that small series called The Dagger that released for a few weeks prior to chapter 480 in the run to the Thousand Year Blood War arc in the manga, that he was going to let Unohana fight and unravel her hair. We just didn't know at the time that Unohana's first fight would also be her last. It would also result in her death, and a lot of people were disappointed to see her go just as the character was really blossoming. I mean, I can't overstate the absolute transformation in perception Unohana's character has had since the reveal of her true nature. It is a complete turnaround. And I think people would have accepted a loophole or a way to keep her alive. It's a little bit like how I personally felt about Ichibei surviving his battle with Yhwach. Obviously, at the end of that fight, he is blown to pieces. And I remember being a little disappointed with that. I remember thinking I'd have liked to have seen him do a little more. And so when a loophole was introduced to bring him back to life, I was perfectly happy with that. Although, of course, the irony is that Ichibei didn't do anything ever again in the manga, so there you go. Anyway, moving on, who does Unohana fight and how? Let's imagine for all intents and purposes that the Vandenreich's invasion of the Soul Society plays out almost identically to the manga. In one fell swoop, the Quincy shadows wash over the Serete, replacing it with the Vandenreich's icy cityscape, and the Sternritter are ready to attack. In the manga, Kenpachi doesn't arrive until quite late, some 30 or so chapters after the invasion has already begun, around about just before the halfway mark or so, in fact, when he rescues Yachiru and Isane from Gremi. So presumably he spent some time in Muken, speaking with Nozarashi and achieving Shikai before finally getting moving. And here's where things can already get interesting. Imagine Unohana, having been saved, takes Kenpachi away and under her wing. Remember, Isane has to have seen and spoken with Kenpachi and Unohana earlier here to facilitate our new narrative earlier than she does in the manga. But we can still get to a point where she is alone and needs to be rescued from Gremi. If in the aftermath of their training, Unohana, now healed, goes with Kenpachi to help him learn, unlock, and wield Shikai, not only would it be really cool to see her in a mentor role to him, even echoing Yamamoto, trying to teach him swordplay, but it would explain why they aren't around when the second invasion begins. Anyway, let's first look at a version of events where Unohana's Retsu persona survives, the more likely of the two by far in my opinion. Kenpachi arrives to rescue Yachiru and Isane from Gremi, and it turns out that he's brought Unohana with him. From here, we could see a couple of different scenarios play out. It's totally possible that Unohana tries to help Kenpachi fight Gremi, by which I mean she provides Kido and healing support, possibly justifying her inclusion in the fight by the scope of Gremi's absurd ability. Or perhaps she only steps in once Gremi conjures a second version of himself, at which point it's no longer a 1v1 battle. In fact, I kind of like that. But also, who says Unohana even has to fight to begin with? Maybe she arrives on the battlefield, but with a terrifying smile assures Gremi that she won't be interfering in their fight, and instead calmly watches as Kenpachi takes on the Sternritter, even going so far as to now call himself definitively the Kenpachi, maybe bringing a small smile to Unohana's face. Perhaps Unohana even notices when Yachiru vanishes upon Kenpachi activating Nozarashi. So it makes sense to me that Unohana wouldn't do anything to begin with. But, like I said, perhaps once Gremi manifests that second version of himself, Unohana finally steps in as well. Again, trying to stay true to the characters makes it difficult to see Unohana actually getting involved in Kenpachi's fight at all. Instead, it seems likely that she would leave it to him and make the most of her healing prowess by working alongside Isane. Speaking of which, though, I actually have what I think is an interesting and well fleshed out idea for what Unohana could get up to in the second invasion, even as her Retsu persona, and I'll be honest with you, I'm surprised at how well it works. This is definitely my favourite scenario. If we take a step back and take a look at the characters involved in this whole Kenpachi subplot, you might notice, or maybe you didn't, that there's a significant chunk of time missing for one of these characters. Time that seems to include some important events that are all happening off screen, and by the time we come back to them have been totally glossed over. Once Gremmy conjures a massive stage for he and Kenpachi to battle on, the bodies of the currently deceased Kensei and Rose go toppling over the side, and Isane rushes to rescue them. She leaps from the edge of the stage and manages to grab them both, and then she isn't seen again for almost 50 or so chapters, when she reappears in Mayuri's lab as one of the Shinigami helping to heal the wounded. So those of you who have been paying attention will have clocked that this means that at some point between Kenpachi's battle with Gremmy and Mayuri's battle with Giselle, Isane somehow loses Kensei and Rose's bodies, and Giselle is able to place them under her control. What happens to Isane? Is she confronted by Giselle? Where does she go? How does she lose these two captains from her care? How do they end up in Giselle's possession as zombies themselves? This whole issue could have been solved by having Isane appear as a zombie alongside Kensei, Rose, and Matsumoto, but alas, she is missing in action. So, how about this for a potential avenue for Unohana? We see Isane leap after Kensei and Rose as Kenpachi and Gremmy prepare to fight, and she takes the two captains and sequesters them away in an attempt to heal or even try to resurrect them if possible. We could even see that maybe they come back to life, and Isane is shocked. She has no idea how this has happened. But of course, this is a small hint towards the fact that if Gremmy stops concentrating on the targets of his imagination, that power will wear off, just as it did with Yachiru and her bones made of cookies. Isane is found by Giselle, who has been skulking around the battlefield, building up her zombie army, as we saw her do when she approached Hitsugaya's fallen body. And now has her sights set on Kensei and Rose, wanting to build up her captain cabinet. I think Isane as well deserves a little time to shine, so perhaps this is a good opportunity for her to release Ite-Gumo and actually show us what it can do, but ultimately she's no match in the face of Giselle, who has both Bambietta and Hitsugaya under her control already. Now, normally you perhaps wouldn't want to reveal the fact that Giselle has both Hitsugaya and Bambietta already under her control. Maybe you could get away with revealing Zombietta, since you already know that Giselle has done something to Bambietta at this point in the story, but normally you would be leaving those reveals for Giselle's fight with Mayuri. However, to be totally honest, and maybe this is controversial, but I would happily remove Mayuri versus Giselle entirely to instead give that fight to the 4th Division. Mayuri is mere chapters away from having another enormous battle all to himself when he fights Pernida anyway. So let's spread the love a little bit. Right, so here's what happens. Isane attempts to hold Giselle and Bambietta off on her own, but she's defeated by the pair of Sternritter, as you'd probably expect, but she does at least get the chance to show off her Shikai. However, just as she's about to be zombified, Unohana arrives and uses her Kido expertise to effortlessly subdue Bambietta, leaving the captain to face off with Giselle, who now also wants Unohana for her growing collection of captain zombies. And this actually works surprisingly well as a parallel, I think. Giselle is known for toying with the dead, for stringing people along in a space between life and death, and her necromantic powers seem like the perfect antithesis to Unohana's healing arts, her skill at weaving life. But it goes deeper than that too. Giselle's whole personality, her whole character, is about presenting this incredibly goofy demeanour in the face of some seriously dark subject matter. And, well, Unohana feels similar. Although her shifts are much more subtle, she too is hiding a very dark true self beneath an otherwise friendlier exterior. Honestly, I think it works really well. So, how would this work? Well, I think Unohana could quickly overwhelm Giselle with her Kido spells, so now both Giselle and Bambietta have been subdued, forcing Giselle to reveal her two trump cards, Hitsugaya and Matsumoto, desperate to reinforce her zombie army with Kensei, Rose, and Unohana herself. At this, Retsu draws her blade and prepares to fight. Now, although Retsu has put down the blade, metaphorically speaking, I don't personally believe that this means that she can't ever use it to fight again, that she won't ever use it to fight again if the situation calls for it. And in fact, this could be a really cool moment. Isane could be horrified, absolutely terrified at the thought that this nightmarish version of Unohana is about to rear her head in front of her. But in reality, this wouldn't be Yachiru Unohana fighting at all. The glee, the fun, it would all be gone, all be stripped away. Instead, Retsu Unohana fights with care and consideration, clashing with both Hitsugaya and Matsumoto at the same time, yes, but ultimately spends the battle looking for ways to save them. This is the mantra of Retsu Unohana, everything she has become in this persona embodied by the blade, proving that the blade doesn't have to just embody Yachiru. It can be handled in two totally different ways. That being said, I'm not averse to injecting a little fan service in here as well, though. Because I'm thinking Unohana successfully subdues both Hitsugaya and Matsumoto, knocking the two of them out, only to find that Giselle has taken Isane hostage and is threatening to zombify her with a drop of her blood. Although Unohana wouldn't transform all the way, she wouldn't unravel her hair or anything like that, there could absolutely be a single panel of her eyes reverting to their Yachiru state as she turns to look over her shoulder at Giselle and Isane. Before she blitzes Giselle faster than the Sternritter can even register, blood erupting from her as she's slashed all over. And of course, Unohana, in that one movement, rescued Isane at the same time, so there's no danger of the blood going over her. And so Giselle is forced to flee. Because of course, these slashes from Unohana, they aren't enough to kill the undying cockroach, but she is forced to retreat all the same. Similarly to how in the manga, Giselle escapes after being stabbed by Kensei. And this means that she has to leave her Shinigami zombies behind too. Maybe she somehow manages to get away with Bambietta, leading to the scene from chapter 603, where she tries to drain Bambietta's blood to recover her strength. However, this leaves Unohana and Isane with Hitsugaya and Matsumoto, both of whom are still zombified. Cue the arrival of Mayuri and Nemu, as Mayuri professes to be able to save them with a sadistic grin on his face. I feel like Unohana and Mayuri bantering back and forth on the battlefield would make for a nice little callback to their dialogue exchange in Waco Mundo, where Unohana insults him. Now, removing the Mayuri versus Giselle battle does get rid of the Uranka zombies, which is a shame and really my only reservation, so I wonder if there is somewhere else they can appear instead. And to be honest, I think it would make for a more impactful moment if a huge force of captains arrived to help Byakuya against Pepe. Unohana, Isane, Mayuri, Nemu, the resurrected Hitsugaya and Matsumoto, as well as a revitalized Kensei and Rose, all appear on the scene to lay the smackdown on the despicable Sternritter of love, alongside the Sternritter he's betrayed. Because I've always said that Pepe should have been the precursor to the two sides working together, foreshadowing, if you will, that the two sides can, in fact, team up successfully. Personally, this makes total sense to me for Unohana's path in the second invasion, and it helps to close a somewhat glaring gap in the timeline involving Isane and the soon-to-be zombified captains. After this, all of these Shinigami proceed to make their way to the lab in preparation for the next stage of the war. So that's what I could see happening with Retsu Unohana specifically. Now, Yachiru Unohana is a completely different story altogether. For starters, she probably wouldn't arrive at the same time as Kenpachi. Instead, I could honestly just imagine her emerging from the shadows at some point to massacre a group of Soldat before attempting to seek out a Sternritter. Approaching this from a narrative perspective, however, really does hammer home just how much more far-fetched it seems for Unohana to arrive in her Yachiru persona, not just because of the implications of handing over the name of Kenpachi, but just because it's hard to imagine her really interacting with anyone like this, let alone characters like Isane. Now that being said, she does appear slightly less murderous in her flashback with the child Zaraki, so perhaps that's how she would present herself to Isane, with her hair unfurled, but still mostly the same Unohana her vice captain knows and loves. But if she does indeed race off to find a Sternritter to butcher, who are the available options? Well, again, there's Giselle still, although I think she definitely works better in the previous scenario that we came up with. Then there's Nanana Najakoop, who at this point in the manga is meant to be following Renji. And since we know that goes nowhere, that could possibly be used here. Maybe Unohana blindsides Nanana as he's continuing to stalk Renji. Now the only issue with that is if someone like Yachiru Unohana pounces on Nanana without him having any time at all to observe her power, I think he is dead, without a doubt. So maybe we could try someone like Robert Akutrone instead, because Robert also hasn't been seen in the second invasion yet by this point, and actually I think that might make for a more interesting fight. Robert is possibly quick enough to keep up with Yachiru, at least in his Volston dish anyway, and while I ultimately don't think that he would be a match for her, him at least slightly pressuring Byakuya after the captain returns from the royal palace makes him a better fit than Nanana. Who else is available at this point? A lot of the Sternritter have actually already been killed or defeated. I mean, I guess any of the Bambis are technically free to fight, although they all converge on the battlefield at the same time to ambush Kenpachi later on. Giselle clearly goes off on her own to collect corpses, so maybe the others do their own thing as well. It might be interesting to see a duo of Candice and Meninas attempting to fight off Yachiru. Candice trying to assault the captain at range, while Meninas gets up close and personal, flinging gigantic punches at Unohana as she dances through and around them with her sword slashes. If I'm being completely honest, I don't think there are many Sternritter involved in the second invasion who could take on Yachiru alone. It might be fun for her to run into someone like Askin, for example, only for him to sense the bloodlust emanating from her and decide to hightail it out of there. I'm not saying I don't think Askin wouldn't be able to defeat Yachiru Unohana, because he probably would, but I also don't think he would want to deal with it either at the same time. But that segues nicely into the final portion of this video, surmising what kind of a difference Unohana's appearance might actually make to the second invasion. Now, ever since her battle with Kenpachi, I can't help but feel as though Unohana has caught a lot of flack, as though her dying in that fight somehow makes her weak, despite the fact it is what she wanted. Going into that battle, it all played out exactly as she intended from the start, and I think it's preposterous to consider her anything but still one of the strongest, most battle-hardened captains of the entire lineup. I can't help but think people often misconstrue or misunderstand just how unbelievable Unohana's skill actually was with the blade. Kenpachi eventually stabbing Unohana through the throat after 3 solid days of fighting doesn't take anything away from the fact that she effectively killed him hundreds and hundreds of times over, and did so for a while before he even landed a hit on her. This is the same Kenpachi, by the way, who defeated Neutra, carved up Yami, and killed 3 Sternritter with ease. The same one who became stronger with every battle. It's precisely for this reason that I think Unohana would be able to tussle with just about any of the regular Sternritter involved in the second invasion, possibly with ease. That being said, I don't necessarily think her presence would be enough to turn the tide of the battle. After all, Kenpachi was supposed to have surpassed her as a result of his training, and let's face it, destroying the meteor aside, which was a pretty big deal, he doesn't really achieve anything at all in the second invasion, and in fact is almost killed. What I mean to say is, I think it takes more than one incredibly skilled and powerful fighter to really shift the momentum in a battle of this kind of scale. Well, there's no doubt the Gotei 13 would have absolutely been better off if Unohana had still been around, whether she was simply there to heal the wounded, or to fight, or to do both. And I think certainly if she were in her Yachiru persona, she may have killed or at least defeated 1 or 2 additional Sternritter, which would have made life even easier for Ichigo upon his return from the palace. But yeah, like I said, I actually quite like my idea for Retsu's storyline in particular, and how it fits into the second invasion. Even if it does involve a little rewriting, and yes, even the removal of an entire fight, but it feels like one of the most realistic ways she could have been incorporated, while trying to stay true to the character and to what she wanted. Whereas involving Yachiru Unohana fully is a lot trickier, and feels much closer to fanfiction than anything else. Even if ostensibly that's all this really is. Alright everyone, but that's it for today's video. As always, I do hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you took something of value away from it as well. Do let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. How would Unohana have fared in the second Quincy invasion? I would love to know how you think that might have played out, whether she was her Retsu persona or her Yachiru persona. I'd love to know how you think things would have gone down, so do please let me know. How do you think any of this would have worked? How could it be squared away that she actually survives her fight with Kenpachi? And what do you think of my version of her storyline as Retsu in particular? I'd love to get your thoughts down in the comments below. Alright everyone, as always, thank you so very much for watching. Again, I hope you enjoyed it. Consider hitting subscribe if you haven't done already. Consider checking me out on Patreon as well and supporting over there. As always, a massive thank you and a huge shout out goes out to everyone who is doing just that. Your support is making a world of difference as we navigate these kind of rocky waters here on YouTube at the moment. It's a little bit, interesting to say the least, but your support is making so very much of a difference, even if that is just being here, watching the videos. I really do appreciate each and every one of you. Okay, everyone, until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.